If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnette Heintze.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnette Heintze. Thank you for joining today. Our guest is Belinda Waggoner. Belinda is the founder and president of People, an HR consultancy which brings the expertise, systems, and assistance necessary to take your people programs, and culture from the mundane and ordinary to the extraordinary. Belinda, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. To kick things off, why don't you talk about your professional journey and what you've seen evolve in HR practices over the last few years?
Thanks so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. Goodness, it's been a long career in HR, seriously. I grew up in the legal profession, not a lawyer, but I practiced HR in large law firms and across the U.S. with multiple offices. It was all kinds of fun, and I really enjoyed it. I got to a point where I recognized, and I probably carried the idea of this business around with me for some time, that what I was practicing was very corporate HR. And what I wanted to practice was kind of the growth engine HR that I knew HR could be. At a certain point in my career, I decided that this business idea I'd been carrying around forever should come to fruition, where I could provide the kind of HR support that smaller businesses needed, but didn't have a need for a full-time person to provide, and really teach kind of the entrepreneurial community how to grow a business, because the people of your business are truly the engine of the business. We've been blessed to be in business for 13 years now. Enjoyed every minute of it. It's had its ups and downs, as every entrepreneurial journey does, but it really has been kind of the crown and glory of my career to be able to practice HR the way I always felt as though it could be.
Oh, that's fabulous. So, I know you mentioned there that you believe HR can fuel growth as a company matures. And I think that's a highly important topic to explore a little bit. Why don't you explain what you've seen and how it works best with companies that are in a growth mode?
Sure. So, entrepreneurs have a tendency to basically neglect HR as a discipline within their businesses. They will secure business advice, finances, financial support, IT support, but they don't always recognize that the people of their business are the thing that's going to make or break them. If you don't have the correct people on board with the right direction, I always view the people of an organization as the actual engine that runs the business. No entrepreneur can do that alone. And if they do neglect the fact that they need to invest in the discipline of HR, then I really think they're missing an opportunity to kind of catapult their growth. No entrepreneur can do it on their own. They're going to need people to do it with them. And if you don't have the correct level of HR support, as so many don't, then you probably are not going to be able to achieve what you hope to. That's the bottom line.
Yep. So for an entrepreneur out there starting a company today, what are the most important HR questions you would encourage them to consider? And what's the right foundation for HR from day one? How should I approach that?
So often we're called in at the point at which an entrepreneur has grown a company. Maybe they're 2 or 3 years old. They have 10 to 12 employees. And unfortunately, during our initial part of the engagement, we get to undo a lot of the things that they've established as their HR practices, whether it's because they are non-compliant. Entrepreneurs are not HR directors. They don't know when their not doing the right things under the federal or the state regs. They may have kind of misaligned policies, which I know that all sounds terribly corporate, but if you establish kind of your internal HR policies early on, you really avoid totally, well, not totally, but you mostly avoid running the risk of discriminatory practices down the road, which is often what gets so many entrepreneurs in trouble. So that's the compliance piece. But then there's the whole cultural piece, which is, who are you as a business? Entrepreneurs focus so much on how they appear to the rest of the world versus, via their external brand. They seldom focus on how they're going to deliver that external brand through execution of their internal brand. So, for instance, if your external brand says you have the best customer service in the universe, and you're not somehow preaching that and enshrining that in everything you do at a people level, then the first time a customer is going to call in, there's going to be a disconnect between what you're presenting as your external brand and what your internal brand actually is. So what we attempt to do, in addition to making sure that our business owners don't go to jail, is to try to help them understand who they truly are as a business. And then we weave that through all of the policies, all of the expectations, whether it be through performance review or goal setting or incentives or you name it, any people practices that you possibly can, and embody that overall brand so that when you present in the marketplace, you can actually deliver on your external brand promise.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. So that's wonderful to hear about as a company starts. But let's assume now we have a company that's on fire and they're beginning to scale. And you mentioned a couple of the challenges, but let's explore those challenges a little deeper as it relates to AR. And then how do companies best address these issues they've created for themselves?
Tackle them head on. Don't be afraid to touch them. So there's several things that we see in a high growth company. The first is that their policies or their practices have been developed, but not been developed in a scalable way. So you've got to keep pace with the competitive nature of the marketplace. Are you compensating your employees appropriately? Are you providing them the best benefits your money can buy? Are you giving them opportunities for growth so that you will not be in a position where you're losing people constantly because turnover is incredibly expensive? It's positioning yourself in that marketplace to be responsive to the level at which your company is. One of the things that we often see, especially as startups start to achieve a certain level of growth, is that not everybody's going to make the trip. The person who was a stellar employee when you were 5 to 10 people and maybe grossing $1 million in revenue may not be the right person when you're sitting at 100 people and $20 million in revenue.
Yeah.
That doesn't make either of you a bad person, but we have seen companies be completely held back by what we call sort of that sacred cow syndrome, which is, well, Peter can't go anywhere else because he's been with us from the beginning. Well, you can redeploy Peter in a different role. It doesn't mean he has to go, but it may mean that he's not going to be the CFO of your company anymore. I think a lot of the times businesses are held back, both out of loyalty, which I don't discredit that at all. But they hold themselves back because they're not willing to go to market to get the best talent for the level at which the company is operating present day versus where it's come from.
Yeah. No, I actually identify with that exactly because one of the earlier companies I started, built, and sold was I had a challenge with recruiting the right sales leader.
Wow.
And I used to think to sell what we did, you had to have walked in our shoes. You had to have been a Secret Service agent. So I quickly realized that in spite of my efforts to get one of our men or women to take on that role, they weren't the best at it.
They weren't the best at it. Exactly.
Nope. And I had to reach out and identified using various resources. I found a high performing sales leader. And that was the recipe.
It
And
makes
so
all the difference. It makes all the
it
difference.
really did. It made
Right.
a huge difference. So,
As I said, I don't want to discredit the loyalty that entrepreneurs feel to the folks that help them start, but there is a point in time where you have to recognize the adulthood of the business and be willing to move forward.
Yep.
For the sake of the business.
Absolutely. So I think all firms would love to build high performance teams, but a lot of them are left in the dark with that. How does HR help leaders assess what they've got and start building that high performance team?
So truthfully, most of the responsibility of that falls to the leader of the organization. Culture starts at the top. We meet so many business owners that sort of have a sense of where they want to go, but they really don't have a plan of how to get there. If you sit down with the average entrepreneur, they might tell you, well, I want to grow 10x in the next 5 years. Okay, what are the underpinnings of that? What does that look like? What does the organizational structure need to look like in order for you to be able to accomplish that? What team members are going to need to be present on the team in order for you to effectuate that? What development are we going to have to provide your employees if you want to home grow them from within the organization? What development are they going to need? What resources are you going to need to go to market for? I think one of the underlying things that is sort of a frustration is that entrepreneurs sort of have this sense of where they want to go, but they don't recognize that they probably need to spend money to make money. And so they're still operating as a small business and they have a small business mindset. And they're not thinking on a large enough scale to actually be able to accomplish their goals. Because in order to do so, you do need more effective marketing. You need more robust HR support. You need more robust talent pools. All of those things come with a price tag, and you're sort of either all in or you aren't. The flip side of that is the cultural element of it. As you grow, the organization that you thought you were in the beginning may not actually be what you've morphed into. So that internal brand discussion that we had earlier, it really needs a revisit every 2 or 3 years. Like, okay, that's who we were then, but who are we today?
Yeah.
And then 3 years from now, who do we expect to be?
Those are great observations. And I think it's really important for business leaders to fully embrace the idea that culture isn't static, that it changes over time and that it grows to a different culture as your organization can grow. So how does HR help that cultural change when you see the evolution of culture changing as the company's growing?
It's sort of interesting because the longer we've been at this and we've supported so many high growth companies, there are definitely kind of trigger points, and it generally has to do with headcount of all things. Often the first time somebody reaches out to us is when they're 12 to 13 people. They've lost the ability to keep their arms around their people issues. We can sort of whip that into shape at that point. But then the next pivot point appears to be around 50 headcount. At that point, you stop being kind of sort of that startup and you start to have to develop some slightly more corporate kind of elements to your HR program. And there's a definite cultural shift. You might not know the names of every one of your employees' kids. You might have more challenges in securing talent because you're still a smaller company and you may not be in a position to kind of, pay the highest salaries. But there are all sorts of things that you can do to augment because, frankly, no position is always just about the money for people. It really isn't. You probably will experience another pivot point around the 120 mark, and then you'll experience another pivot point around the 200. So quite often what we'll do is as we start to near those benchmarks, we'll have a sit down with our employer and talk about, here are the things that, you're about to cross the 50-person threshold. Here are the things that you should be thinking about. Here are the things that we should probably analyze. Who are you today versus who you were 3 years ago when we began supporting you. All of that then turns into this non-static culture, which you just alluded to, which is, there's time for policy changes. An employee handbook, it's never set in stone. It's never done. It's always morphing and changing. There's regulatory changes, but there's also cultural shifts. You need to be market responsive. Does that mean you need to consider new verticals? What does that mean for the culture of your organization? There's so many considerations. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of organizations, they really don't consider the human aspects of that. They know sort of what they need to do, but they don't recognize what the cultural impact of that is going to be on the people of their organization.
Yep. So, we're talking about high growth environments. And one of the things I think anybody that's been a part of a high growth environment realizes it can be very stressful. And with that, it creates a whole bunch of challenges for business and HR leaders. And employee well-being is something that's gaining a lot of prominence these days. When does HR step in to help advise that business leader, hey, there's some things we need to be doing here? How does that play out?
If we're lucky, we get to kind of be proactive as opposed to reactive on that front. There are so many resources available to businesses that they probably don't even know about, whether it be augmentations to their health and wellness programs, whether it be access to care that couldn't otherwise be provided through health systems. I use the example of the pandemic where, my goodness, we experienced a huge increase in anxiety and mental health issues amongst employees because it was a lot. It was a lot for all of us. But there are resources that a company can avail itself of very inexpensively. All you have to do really is go research those things. What I will say is that one of the things that really drives a lot of it is if the leadership of an organization is stressed to the max, so will the rest of the organization be.
So true.
And you need to pay mind to that. I think a lot of entrepreneurs feel as though they can never take a day off. They can never take a mental health day. You really can't not take those days. If you don't reset, recharge, you aren't going to be good for yourself, but more importantly, you're not going to be good for your business either.
Yep. So that growing company is now starting to look overseas, and there's opportunity to create, global presence. I got to imagine there's some really unique challenges for HR on the global front. Help us understand that.
There are. The best advice I can give, honestly, and I do work with a number of global companies, is our focus is in the US, and we do our best not to pretend to be experts in foreign arenas. So, for instance, we've been privileged to support the US entities of a number of global businesses, but we're solely focused on the support of that US entity. I would honestly say, get yourself the type of HR consultant in the locations in which you plan on doing business, and make sure that those are experts in their field and that they can help you manage through those areas. Don't try and go this alone. There are so many pitfalls. There's so many pitfalls in US regulations that most entrepreneurs are unaware of. It's even more so in the global arena. There are some organizations that are set up to assist you with that, but it's nothing like having an expert on the ground. Again, it's one of those deals where you need to spend money to make money. Make sure that you get things right and that you're working within the regulations of that country. Otherwise, those efforts are going to go totally unrewarded.
Yep. So another aspect that I think all growth companies confront is how do they train their leaders, improve their effectiveness in the organization, and nurture them to be the leader that the organization needs. What's your thoughts on that? Where does HR step in?
I feel as though, obviously, there's so much education available out there.
Mm-hmm.
My personal view, especially with the length of time I've been in HR, is that for most leaders or potential leaders, there is nothing that takes the place of learning by doing. One of the things that we really try to do our best to be to our client companies is to be an educator. So we're not just swooping in and taking care of the HR issues that crop up. We're going to try to help the leader or the supervisor navigate through that so that we're equipping that leader or supervisor to more effectively handle those things going forward. Unfortunately, most leadership, education, certainly from an HR perspective, cannot hope to touch all of the nuances that might be present in any given HR issue, because every single HR issue or every personnel issue is entirely different. You know, it can be you need to discipline somebody, but if you need to discipline somebody that also has a medical condition or is pregnant or has some underlying issue that falls within Title VII, you have to be very careful in the way in which you manage through those processes. And I'm not sure that that off-the-shelf education can really help you and help you kind of navigate you through those individual issues. The other thing that I would encourage our entrepreneurial folks that are listening is that just because somebody is absolutely awesome at the job that they do doesn't mean that they should hit the department.
That is it.
And I see this so often where, you know, Joe, you're awesome. You're so, so great. So we're going to make you manager of the department. Joe may not want that. That's the first thing. Secondarily, Joe may not have the level of leadership traits that are needed for that particular role. And if you don't give Joe any tools, then you're basically running the risk of blowing out a very successful employee.
Yeah, so true. So, Belinda, we've reached the time today, and I have one final question I'd like to ask you, but I ask all our guests, which is, if S2 Verify were to conduct a background investigation on you, would there be any surprises?
I am so boring.
I don't believe that.
You wouldn't even find it a speeding ticket. So I lead a very dull life over here in this HR existence.
All right. I'll leave it at that then. So, but why don't you tell our listeners where they can connect with you and learn more about what's going on in your company and what you're up to?
Sure. I'd be happy to. Thank you for that. So, our website is www.peopleus.com. I like to think that we have a whole bunch of information out there. We have operations out of Kansas City, Kansas, and Jacksonville, Florida. We support companies all across the country, as well as some foreign entities with U.S. ties. And we'd love to chat with you if you ever feel as though you need someone to talk to about the HR stuff.
Well, that's great. I'm sure every business actually needs somebody to talk to about that. So we'll encourage them to reach out. So, but before we sign off, I'd like to have a minute with Bill and Jim, my partners at S2 Verify. Now, in that process that CRAs have to follow, are there any follow-up responsibilities for a CRA once they've sent the 613 letter out?
No, I mean, once we send, it's basically a notification. So it's basically separate from, as we're going to talk about, pre-adverse and adverse action. And so pre-adverse and adverse action is really an employment or employer responsibility. This is a responsibility of the 613 is a responsibility of the CRA, just to notify them that there has been a record found in a public, as Jim says, public in a domain.
So the great news for clients is this is not a responsibility they have to undertake as long as they've selected S2 Verify or another company that has really a strong adherence to compliance requirements. The CRA will handle all of the issues for them regarding the 613. Now, let's assume that the information that we've identified on a candidate and we've notified them that we've found information And as we further digest the information and validate the information, and we find criminal convictions that fall within an area where an employee could be excluded, that requires another letter. Is that correct, Jim? That is what would be referred to as an adverse action letter.
So the process of both finding and reporting a record which could potentially impact the individual's ability to garner employment or gain the job they're applying for, broken into two categories. There's a pre-adverse letter, and then there's an adverse letter, pre-adverse action, adverse action letter. Primarily, the responsibility of those letters falls on the employer. They're obviously inside of the S2Verify system, fully integrated. Clients have full access to them, et cetera. On occasion, we are asked to handle that for an employer on their behalf. And I want to explain what that really means with the advent of ban the box. But functionally, Arnette, to your question, when an employer receives a background report back, and they look at the report and they see a criminal record that they believe could, may not, but could have an impact on that individual's ability to be placed in the position for which they've applied, that's the trigger for a pre-adverse. It's simply telling a candidate, hey, we did this background and we discovered this record. We're giving you a chance to respond to the CRA. If you don't think it's accurate, or if you think there's another issue with that report and or that record, this is your window to do that. And under FCRA, they get like a 5-day window to make contact with us. Now, do they or don't they? Some do, most don't. After the 5-day window, if the employer mentally goes, hey, you know what? We're okay with that. It was a misdemeanor. We're going to go ahead and we're going to let John or Mark or Mary go to work. Nothing else has to be done. Okay, because the pre-adverse was simply a heads up. It wasn't, my term here, a declination or denial. However, in that 5-day window, if the employer decides we're not hiring this individual, that triggers the adverse action letter. Then the adverse action letter then tells the consumer or the candidate really similar language to the pre-adverse, except this one says you're not getting the job. And again, if you disagree, you can reach out to S2Verify or whomever the CRA is to discuss that background. So it's a very rigid process. First one goes, 5 days later, you're hiring the person, nothing happens. 5 days later, you're not. The second letter must go. Now, I mentioned the ban the box challenge that's causing employers to have to think differently. Many states, but I think right now there's probably, Massachusetts, Maryland, Oregon, PA, Texas, Washington, Illinois, California, New York, Florida, to name a few, okay, have very specific language that now either the state and sometimes it's a jurisdiction. So New York City, as in the boroughs, have specific language that doesn't apply outside to the remainder of New York State. But what's important about it is, and this will help explain a little bit why I mentioned employers asking us to handle these letters. The letters now require that an employer be very specific. So when they send the pre-adverse letter, there's language in there, and within our system, it's customizable totally, that the employer has to specifically list the reason, the crime that has been found that's causing the individual not to be considered for the job. And then when the adverse letter goes, the same exact language has to be put back in there. So one of the things that we had to look carefully at to assist an employer, that's a one-on-one relationship. Because when we go to produce the letter off of the client's notification to send it, we have to know what it is we're putting in there. Which crime are you specifically referring to? Because the letter must address it. So it's made the process of pre-adverse and adverse in those states I mentioned and others considering it much more detailed, much more rigid, and more importantly, from a regulation standpoint, employers must adhere to it.
Bill, I know you were going to add some
Yes.
additional.
The time between the pre-adverse and the adverse is 5 business days. So it doesn't include weekends, holidays, et cetera. It's got to be 5 business days before you can send out the adverse from when you send out the pre-adverse. So it's very important because there was some litigation previously several years ago about that. So.
For our audience, please tune in next week when we continue our exploration of topics critical to success in HR. We'll see you then. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work because dreams only work if we do. Belinda, thank you so much for joining today. Very insightful.
Thanks for having me.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.